I am very excited to be here with Lori, who I've known for like 20 years or so. But,
long time.
But every time I read something of hers or see someone interview her, I am more confused and impressed by you, because there's some other entire career you've had that I didn't know about, like going to medical school, or being in television production, or now you're a therapist, and you're also, I know you mostly as a journalist and a writer. So I've only done one thing, which makes me feel very insecure when I talk to you. So let's do some therapy for me.
Oh, I thought we were going to do group therapy, actually. You guys didn't know what you were signing up for when you got here.
I think that's what they were hoping for, to be honest. Like, they look a little tense. This is the first time they've looked up from a screen in many, many years. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
It's been on the New York Times bestseller list for 6, 8, how many weeks?
8.
8 weeks. That's you and Michelle Obama are the only, that's amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the book, which I'm sure you're about to read, is amazing. The concept being, if you don't know, you talk about both being a therapist and then going to therapy.
Right. So in the book, I follow the stories of 4 very different patients. And then there's a 5th patient, and that 5th patient is me, as I go through my own therapy during an upheaval in my own life while I'm helping other people with their own struggles.
And one of the interesting things to me, many interesting things about being human, is that you kind of know what you're not supposed to do as a patient, because you've seen people front in different ways. You've seen all the mistakes that people make, and then you go and make those mistakes yourself when you see a therapist.
Yeah. So when, I think it's interesting when you're training, you go to therapy as part of your hours for licensure. But it's very different. You still feel like a patient then. You're just an intern, you don't really know anything. And then once you've been practicing for a while and you go back, it's a very different experience. It's very hard to take off your therapist hat and just be a person in the room. So I do with my therapist all the things that I end up seeing my patients do with me. I want him to like me. When I leave and there's another patient in the waiting room, she looks so like nice and put together. And I wonder, does he dread my sessions and look forward to hers? One night, since we're at Google, I should mention this. I Google him. I should mention that the reason I got into therapy, I landed in therapy at that moment in my life, was I was planning to marry my boyfriend, and we were planning this life together. And he tells me that he's decided that he can't live with a kid under his roof for the next 10 years. And that Lori kid was my 8-year-old. My 8-year-old had not been hiding in a closet the whole time we were dating. So this came as quite a surprise to me. And my version of the story when I go to therapy, and I really want to emphasize my version of the story, because we'll talk a little bit about what people bring to you and how there are lots of other perspectives that they might not be sharing with you in those initial sessions, is that, he's a sociopath, because, who would do that? And my therapist doesn't agree with that assessment. So one night when I'm obsessing over the boyfriend, and my therapist says to me, you need to stop Google stalking your boyfriend, because he would post pictures of salads in restaurants, and that meant to me, well, I didn't mean anything to him because he's going to restaurants and he's enjoying salads. So my therapist says, you need to stop Googling him. So when you have the urge to Google him, do something different. So I'm sitting there at my laptop and I think, okay, I'm not going to type his name into the search engine. And so I'm going to do something different. So I type in my therapist's name. And that's what I do instead. And I end up going down the Google rabbit hole and finding out nothing weird or creepy about my therapist, but just all of a sudden I have information about my therapist that I didn't before. So I do what my patients do with me. And I know that they Google me because inevitably they slip up. They'll say things like, well, you know what it's like to raise a boy. And, I've never told them I'm a parent or that I have a son or anything like that.
And it's important to not know much about it, because I'm sure most people Google their therapists. I mean,
Well, so you say that, right? I mean, I don't know, show of hands. How many of you have Googled your therapist? There we go. Okay.
Wait,
so
how many of you have
right.
therapists that you haven't Googled? So it's like 50-50, right? No? I'm not good with math. Maybe we should get someone else here to do this.
Yeah, I think all of you can do that. Yeah, so some people do and some people
Interesting.
don't.
I can't imagine having any human interaction where I don't Google someone beforehand. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Wow.
I want to know what I'm getting into, if there's information to be had. But the argument that you make in the book is that a therapist, in essence, is kind of a blank slate.
Well, I think that the point is that nobody wants to go and talk to a brick wall. Nobody wants to go talk to a robot. And so, the irony is that I say at the beginning of the book that my most important credential is that I'm a card-carrying member of the human race. My humanity is my greatest tool in the therapy room. And yet, people don't really want to hear about it. I talk about in the book that I had a colleague who she had been trying to get pregnant and had a really tough time, and she finally got pregnant, and she was standing in a Starbucks when her OB called and said that the pregnancy wasn't viable. And she burst into tears standing in that Starbucks, and a patient happened to walk in, saw the crying therapist, left, and never came back. And so, I think there's that tension between wanting your therapist to be a real person and also not wanting to see their humanity.
So you want them to have enough life experience where they can give you advice, but you don't want to know that they have emotions, or what is it, or that they have trouble, or what is it that Googling your therapist, what's the damage you can do?
So for example, when I Googled my therapist, I found out that his father had died at a relatively young age, middle-aged, but he had been a marathon runner, and he had suddenly died of a heart attack, per the obituary I found. And so I had been waxing poetic in my therapy sessions about my close relationship with my own father, who was about to turn 80, and he was ill, and I was so glad that I had this time with him where we could say goodbye and really have these important moments together. And I didn't know this about my therapist until I Googled him. So now when I went back to therapy, I was editing myself. I felt like, well, I don't want to talk about this beautiful relationship that I'm having, this goodbye that I'm having with my father, because it might make him feel bad. And the problem with editing yourself, of course, is that, you can't feel free to talk about anything that you want to talk about. And he noticed it. He noticed that I was editing myself. He didn't know why, but he noticed it, and I eventually confessed to it, and all the air returned to the room. And we had this incredible discussion about my father on a completely different level that we couldn't have had if I had been hiding that information. And I think, the other thing, you mentioned earlier is that people often keep secrets from their therapists. So there are the secrets that we keep from the world and from the people that we know. And then there are secrets we keep from our therapists. And then there are secrets we keep from ourselves. And Carl Jung called secrets psychic poison, because secrets are really corrosive, but they're also all about shame. And so when people come in and they tell me their stories, I'm listening to what I like to say is the music under the lyrics. I'm listening to their story, but I'm also listening to what they're not telling me. What is the sort of underlying pattern or struggle that got them there in the first place that maybe they have some shame around? And so they're telling the story in a certain way. And I'm listening for what are the parts that they're not telling me.
I'm avoiding giving away anything in the book because it really reads like a story or a couple stories, and then they have real arcs. So I know I've talked to you in the past in front of an audience and almost gave stuff away, but what kind of things, it shocks me that people hide things from their therapist, because to me the thrill of going to a therapist is to tell them all the junk I won't tell anyone else.
Well, I also think there's like a gender difference there. So men will come in and they'll say, I've never told anyone this before. And then what they tell me is so mild. It's like, there's this thing with my neighbor. It's like, what? That was the thing you've never told anyone before? Women will come in and they'll say, I've never told anyone this before, except for my mother, my sister, and my best friend. So like they've told some people, and the thing that they have been holding, the thing that feels very private to them, is usually a lot deeper than I can see why they have shame around it. With men, I think it's so hard culturally for them to be vulnerable on any level. So, it's interesting that when you say, why do people keep secrets? Again, I think it has to do with if I tell you the truth of who I am, you may not like me, you may lose respect for me, I may be shunned. And the reality is that the truth of who they are is what draws me toward them. And I think that's the glue. That's what draws people toward one another. It's where we see ourselves in each other. It's the connections that we make with each other comes from revealing the truth of who we are. So the irony is that the performative aspect where people come and they want to kind of entertain you and be funny and all of that, that bores me. That's when I'm going to get bored. But if you actually show me who you are, I'm going to be very interested in your story.
So have you been listening to any of the Howard Stern interviews? Because he has a book out.
Yes.
So he talks about how therapy just changed his life as a human being and even as an interviewer and the show. But he talks about when he first went to therapy, he started doing his show for the therapist and imitating his parents, and the therapist was not laughing and not amused, and that's kind of a heightened version of what you're talking about, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, so many times we come to therapy and we think, I'm going to make this person like me. And it's a way of not talking about what you really need to be talking about.
Because I'm wondering why people want their therapist to like, is it because you're going to show so much of yourself that if this person doesn't like you, you suck? Or why is it that you want your therapist to like you? It's someone you're paying and that's seeing outside of this room, so why do you care?
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
You don't want your therapist to like you?
I've never been to more than like 2 or 3 sessions in a row. So I've never had like a therapist that way. I've gone for issues or for dumb reasons, but so you want your therapist to like you because you want everyone to like you?
I think I think that we have sort of a natural human need to want to be liked and also to want to be understood, right?
Those are different though, right?
They're different, but when you share your story, so I'm listening not just for the story that someone is telling me, but I'm listening to their flexibility with the story. So often somebody is gunning for you to validate their story, as I was when I went to my therapist. My story was clearly my boyfriend is missing some marbles, because who does that? And how did he not know that earlier? And, that was my story. And I wanted validation. And I talk a lot in the book about the difference between idiot compassion and wise compassion. So idiot compassion is what our friends do. Yeah, he's a jerk. Yeah, your boss shouldn't have done that. Yeah, your coworker was like that. But wise compassion is when what a therapist does, which is they hold up a mirror to you and help you to see your reflection in a way that maybe you would choose not to. So my therapist, his question was, well, how did you not see this? What was your role in this? And I had to be willing to look at that in order to see the story more accurately so that I wouldn't repeat that kind of thing again. And it's really important that we listen to the wise compassion. It's very hard to do with your friends or with your partner because they have agendas. Partly they want to help you, but the other part of their agenda is, but if you change in this way, you will make my life less difficult. Right? And so we're very averse to change, the wise compassion, when it comes from our partners or our friends. But when a therapist does it, they don't have an agenda. And I think sometimes we're more open to that.
And the idiot compassion is what we should practice with our partners? Like, you should not attempt wise compassion with your partner, right?
I think there are ways to do it. I think that people welcome that kind of feedback, but I think it has to be done in a certain way that maybe sometimes when people are doing it because of their agenda, it doesn't come across that way. It doesn't come across in, I really want to help you see something. It comes across as, when you do that, it bothers me.
Mm-hmm. And the wise compassion, a lot of that is just seeing other people's perspective, right?
It's seeing yourself in a way that you aren't able to. I think a lot of what happens is we come to therapy and we want someone to say, yes, you're right. Yes, this is what happened. No, you shouldn't talk to your mother-in-law. Here's right. What the situation is.
Do people really have problems with their mother-in-law in this day and age? Is that still an issue?
I think first of all, I think a lot of people come to therapy with the sort of Sartre philosophy of, hell is other people. Help me manage these other people in my life. And I think that, yes, the world is filled with difficult people. We all know them. A lot of them share share our last name. Nobody goes through life and doesn't meet difficult people. But sometimes hell is us. Sometimes we are the cause of our difficulty. And sometimes, I think that we all have blind spots. And there are ways that we shoot ourselves in the foot over and over and over and end up in the same place repeatedly. And that's when we have to say, you need to see something about what you're doing. It can't just be that all of these other people are problematic. They might be problematic, but how are you responding to them? And can you have more agency over the way that you respond? And can you make different choices so you're not stuck or trapped?
Yeah, my favorite character besides you in the book is the guy who just keeps bellowing idiot at everything. And it just cracks me up every time. And everyone is doing something wrong. And he's just trapped in that mind frame.
Yeah.
And then he has a secret that he's really hiding from you.
Right, because it's too painful for him to face. And this is a person who's very successful in life. And from the outside, he's a very high achieving person. But he has a lot of trouble interpersonally because he thinks that everybody else is an idiot and he knows better. And, sometimes he does, by the way. There is some truth to that. He's very bright. But there's also a way of going about and moving through the world that protects him. So he can keep everybody at bay. He can keep everybody at a distance. It's very hard for anybody to get close to him, including his wife and his children. And, and there's something that there's a tragedy in his life that's revealed in the book that I don't know about at first.
How long does it take for you to know about it?
It's months. I've been seeing him for months, and there's this
once a week for months?
Yeah. He's very condescending to me. What people do in the therapy room is sort of a microcosm of what they do out in the world. So he can be very insulting, very abrasive, and he does that to people out in the world too. He
likens your relationship upon first meet as you being his prostitute.
Yes. He's charming when you first meet him. He's a real charmer. But actually, he's the person I think that for those of you who have read the book, that people come to love the most. I think of all the people's stories that we follow, because once you see who he really is, he becomes so human and so lovable. And I end up developing a deep affection for him. And I think the reader does too.
Okay, when people are withholding secrets from you through possibly months, what are the buckets those secrets fall into?
Oh, they can be anything. I mean, I think I've heard, the gamut. I think that secrets keep people trapped, though. I think eventually they start to realize that they're going to have to talk about the things that are hardest to talk about. My own therapist had this great analogy one day. He said, you remind me of this cartoon, and it's of a prisoner shaking the bars, desperately trying to get out. But on the right and the left, the bars are open. And he was trying to explain to me that a lot of what I was complaining about was, there were ways for me to get around those bars, but that I preferred the bars. I preferred the position of like, I'm trapped, I can't get out. The problems are all circumstantial and situational and out there. Because if we walk around the bars, we are free, and with freedom comes responsibility. And a lot of times we don't want to take responsibility for our own lives. We would rather let other people make decisions for us, and then we can blame them when things go badly. And so, and I think a lot of the time too, we don't want to see the opening there because we don't want to change. Change is really hard because with change, even positive change, comes loss. You have to give up something very familiar to you, even if the familiar thing is miserable or unpleasant. So we resist change. We resist it mightily. And that's one of the things that we do in therapy is we always like to say that insight is the booby prize of therapy, meaning you can have all the insight in the world, but if you don't make changes out in the world, the insight is useless. So a person might come in and they'll say, well, now I understand why I keep having those arguments with my wife, right? But then they go home and they do the exact same thing. It doesn't matter that you have the insight if you're not going to change what you do out there.
And what is the trick to making, not the trick, what is the process of making that change? Because I find in my own life that I can sort of make the change, and then the willpower kind of runs out pretty quickly by the second or third time it happens, and I get back in the same fight.
Yeah, exactly. It's really hard to change what we're doing. We're neurologically wired in a certain way, and you have to rewire those pathways and do something different. So in therapy, it's not like you come in every week, you talk about stuff, you gain some insight, you leave, nothing happens during the week differently, and you come back. That's a waste of the work that you're doing. You have to be both accountable and vulnerable when you come to therapy. And those are they sound like two very different things. But you have to be vulnerable in the room and then accountable so that when you come back next week, well, how did you use whatever insights you gained out in the real world in tangible ways? And I think that a lot of people, they'll say to me when they find out that I'm a therapist, well, either they'll run away, like if I'm at a barbecue or something,
really?
they'll run away. Yeah.
Because they feel like you're going to see into their heads?
Yeah, like you're going to psychoanalyze them, which is the weirdest thing because it's like if I said I was a gynecologist, nobody would be like, are you going to give me a pelvic exam right now?
Right.
But like they'll be like, are you going to analyze me right now? Why would I do that at this barbecue?
Yeah, but you are silently doing it.
I'm not.
But kind of.
Although I did have a funny incident where this couple started talking to me and they said, well, do you do couples therapy? And I said, I do. A significant part of my practice actually is couples therapy. And then this couple proceeded to get into a fight right in front of me at this barbecue.
On purpose?
No, it was like she wanted him to go to couples therapy and he didn't want to go to couples
Sure.
therapy. And they got into this argument and I excused myself to get a drink.
Wow.
But people do have weird reactions when you say that you're a therapist.
And so the other one is to run away or to start, obviously, if you're on a plane or something, people tell you their problems, I assume.
I
If you're a
read.
gynecologist,
I
they probably do
read. I
the
have
same thing.
earbuds in.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
But people...
I say I'm a writer. If people say, what do you do? I generally will say I'm a writer because it's easier. I won't get into those conversations.
And do people recognize you? Because there's no photo in the column in the Atlantic, right?
There is.
There is.
Yeah.
So, Lori, was this in the introduction? You write this awesome column for the Atlantic called
Dear Therapist.
Yeah.
It's a kind of a non-advice advice column, which sounds useless, but it's kind of like when you come to therapy, so many people want advice. Just tell me what to do. What would you do? And I can't tell people what to do for so many reasons. And one of them is that the version of the story that they're telling me is mediated through their perspective, right? They're sort of gunning for me to take a certain position. I don't have all the information and I might give them really bad advice because I don't have the whole story. So A, my advice might not be good. B, I want them to learn to make their own decisions. We want to encourage people's independence. We have the worst business model ever, which is from the day you come in, we're thinking about how can we get you to not need us anymore.
Most people don't know that.
They don't know that. I think that people have this misconception about therapy that you come to therapy, you talk about your childhood ad nauseum, and you never leave.
Or the
right?
therapist,
People are laughing because that's their misconception.
Or the therapist doesn't want you to leave because they have a monetary interest in keeping you there.
Right. I think if the therapist is good, that they're not worried about filling their slots.
Right. But do you make that clear? Like at the beginning, like we are going to try and. This isn't permanent. We're going to end this at some point, or how does that discussion?
I think we talked very early on about what are your goals? Why are you here? What are you wanting out of this? And those goals might shift, right, as time goes on and we learn more about what's going on. But our goal is to encourage people's independence. It's like raising a child, where you want your child to be able to not need you in the same way anymore. So I think that when people come in and they say, what do I do about this problem? And then what do I do about this problem? You're not helping them because you want them to be able to problem solve on their own and to trust themselves and to make better decisions than they have in the past. And that's part of what they're doing is, as you guys know here at Google, right? When you make mistakes, you learn from them. So if they make a decision and it doesn't work out, well, what do you learn from that experience? What can you do differently next time? Why did that decision not work out? And that's what we're helping them to do.
As a journalist, I was just thinking about something you said a minute ago. How much of you, when someone tells you their story from their perspective, and they're only seeing it through their perspective, how much do you want to just bring some of the other people in the story into the room?
Well, that's the beauty of couples work, right? Is that you get to see both sides of what's happening. And so we don't do sort of like argument of the week, like a lot of people like to do couples therapy, which I think is a complete waste of time, where you come in and then you try to like parse the argument of the week, and then you kind of solve that problem, and then they go home, and then they're going to have another fight, and then they come in the next week, and then it's argument of the week again. That's a waste of time. I want people to see, well, what are the underlying patterns where you guys keep getting into arguments? What are you really arguing about? Because we talk about the difference between content, which is sort of up here, and process, which is what's happening down here. And what's happening between them in process is what's causing the arguments up here. So we talk a lot about process as opposed to the content of, well, yes, the laundry and this and that. And
wait, that blows my mind. This is causing that, because the way I think about it is like this, hopefully, most of the time, the content is somewhat irrelevant, and it's just, there's always going to be content. There's always going to be conflict.
Right.
And that I would just like my wife and I to fight better. But I don't think of it as like...
See, I want to avoid the fight in the first place.
Maybe not fight, resolve.
Like I want to avoid the conflict, So why do you guys keep getting into conflict about this? What is it really about? And depending on the couple, it's going to be about different things. And that helps them to not fight so much, to not get into conflict so much.
Let me throw this out, because my wife found this. This is not...
Is a consult? We're doing a consult right now?
No, it's not. It's going to sound like it is, and it is, but it's not. I'll be on tape saying this. I was watching the TV.
See, you said it wasn't going to be therapy, but it.
No, because it's not about me. It's just like, I'm going to throw out an opinion that's offensive. Is what's about to happen.
Okay.
And you're going to tell me.
And I'm going to agree with you.
Probably not. But you're going to tell me why it's wrong. So I was watching the TV show Barry, and this actress on the show is acting out physically abusive husbands. Mm-hmm. And I was watching her act this out, and I was like, most arguments have the same general arc as what I believe a physically abusive husband is like, which is that someone says something that goes a little bit above, maybe on purpose, to get out their emotions and to bring themselves down. They throw out something very mean and heated. Then they apologize. Then in the abusive case, they hit. In the non-abusive case, they don't. And then they apologize, and the other person comforts them. Mm. And I was like, the abusive version seems to have the same arc, just way more dramatic with violence. Is that wrong? Is there something completely different about the abusive?
Some couples do fight like that, but some don't. Some have a totally different, dynamic to their.
Like some people just get cold and shut off, and there's
all kinds of ways
how many?
People fight. As many different variations as there are people.
That's
right?
Beautiful. Like we're snowflakes in the way we fight?
It's I think that you have to remember that so many times what people are fighting about is not about the person in front of them. It's only partly about that. It's about their histories and the beliefs and the narrative that they've been carrying with them throughout their lives. And I think it's really nice that I've been a journalist and a writer before I was a therapist, because I work a lot with the stories that people bring in. I almost feel like sometimes as a therapist, I'm an editor where I'm editing their first draft. Like, here's the story that they've been carrying around with them. I'm unlovable. Nothing ever works out for me. In the case of that person we were talking about earlier, I'm better than everybody else. Whatever the story is that they're carrying around. And often it's a faulty narrative. Often it's the lens through which they see every interaction. And so when they're fighting with their partner, they're seeing it through the lens of, I'm unlovable, I'm unworthy, nobody understands me, whatever it is, whatever their story is. And so we have to understand, what is the history that you're bringing to this? And then what's happening sort of historically, and then what's happening in the present. And those can be two very different things.
And how long into therapy can you usually see someone's lens, like the rough outline of it?
It depends. I think it with couples, I think you see it much more quickly because you're actually seeing it in vivo. You're watching an interaction happen as opposed to somebody narrating an interaction that already happened. But I think in therapy with individuals, you see it pretty quickly. You can see what they're doing and how they're interacting with you. And I think people forget that the relationship in the room is so important. So I think it's not like, well, I'm going to pay this person and this person's going to provide a service for me and then I'm going to leave. But you're actually having a relationship with your therapist in the room. And it's so important that study after study shows that the most important factor in the success of someone's therapy isn't the therapist training or the modality they use or the number of years of experience, although of course those things are important, but it's the relationship that the person has with the therapist. So somebody is going to, whatever somebody does out in the world, in their relationships, they're inevitably going to do in the room with me. Just like with my therapist, I very much did whatever I did out in the world in the room with him. And I write about that in the book.
And having found what sounds like an amazing therapist for yourself and seen so many patients, is it just a feeling you have when you know it's the right therapist? Or usually you guys have a lot in common and similar demographics? Or what is it that makes that relationship work, if there's anything besides a feeling?
It's chemistry, right? It's a
Right.
feeling of, I feel heard, I feel understood. This person's going to call me on my bullshit, but in a I like to call them compassionate truth bombs. This person will deliver some compassionate truth bombs because you don't want to just go to somebody who's going to agree with everything you say or just empathize with you every week, but to say, I want you to look at this. I want you to look at sort of what's going on from this perspective that you might not have considered before. So I think if you go to a first session, and I think a first session really is a consultation. It's not you're signing up for the long term. It's to say, I want to see what it's like to be in the room with this person. And if you leave that session and you feel understood and you feel like this person was easy to talk to, I would go back for a second session.
Do you find that people in the tech industry have specific issues or come up with the same issues a lot?
We're going to send out a survey after this talk. I think that there are certain issues that I see in certain industries. So we're in Los Angeles. So if I see people in the entertainment industry, I might see some patterns, but I also think everybody is unique. I see people in the tech industry because there are a lot of tech companies down here. There are certain common problems that they might experience. But I also feel like, again, how you grew up and how you think about the world is going to be the most influential thing in terms of how your problems manifest. So, I think about that in terms of diagnosis too. A lot of people ask about diagnosis, and I address this in the book where, like that one patient we were talking about, does he have narcissistic personality disorder? Maybe. But I think that you can lose a person through a diagnosis, that you lose what's unique about them and you start to see them as a diagnosis and not as a person. So I think the diagnosis is useful in terms of maybe understanding how to best help them, but it's not useful if you look at them as, oh, here comes the person with narcissistic personality disorder. You have to just see the person. It's like John is just John. And, he is what he is, and he's multifaceted, and that's how you have to look at people.
Do most people want to know their diagnosis?
No, I don't think so.
Interesting.
I don't think so. I think most people want to feel better. I think most people come in and they want, I think a lot of people come in and mostly they'll say, help me to change these other people out there, or they'll say, and they don't say it in those words, or the other thing they'll say is, help me not to feel. Help me not to feel my pain, my sadness, my anxiety, my grief. Help me not to feel. And what I try to help them to understand is that you can't mute one feeling without muting the others. You can't mute the pain without also muting the joy. And also when you kind of push down or try to suppress your feelings, they get stronger because feelings need air, metaphorically speaking. So, and I think that has to do with the way that we look at our physical health differently from our emotional health. So with our physical well-being, if something feels wrong, if we're feeling pain somewhere, if you're feeling chest pain, you're probably going to go see a cardiologist before you have a massive coronary. But if you're feeling emotional pain, if something feels off emotionally, instead of getting it checked out, most people say, well, I have a roof over my head and food on the table, and what do I really have to complain about? And so they don't go get it checked out. And then they end up in therapy if they're having the equivalent of, say, an emotional heart attack. And then they're really in crisis. And first of all, it's harder to treat if you come at that point.
Oh, really?
It is.
Is that because
you're in the middle of this crisis now, and so much has happened, and you're not functioning in the same way. But the other thing is that you've suffered unnecessarily for all of that time. Where you didn't have to. So I think this whole idea of, that feelings are bad, that certain feelings are bad, or we value certain feelings differently, right? So, sadness, bad feeling, get rid of it. Anxiety, bad feeling, get rid of it. Our feelings are like a compass. They tell us where to go, what to do. So if you're feeling sadness, that's information. Well, what do I need to change in my life? Where is this coming from? If you're feeling anxiety, what is that telling me? It's good information to have. So if you mute that, you're also kind of like walking around without a compass.
How many percentage-wise of people you see or just notice in society of men are channeling all of their emotions into anger in order to just either because society is pushing them that way or they don't want to deal with the other feelings?
Well, we talk about anger as being like, if you can picture an iceberg, right? And so like the part that's submerged are all the other sort of what we'd call maybe more tender feelings. Anger is the easiest thing to feel, right? It's like, it's so cathartic. It's all outward directed. And so like, if you picture like, here's sort of like the watermark, right? And here's like anger, the anger iceberg up here. You can see the anger, it's the easiest thing. But underneath the anger is usually something like sadness, anxiety, grief, those kinds of things.
Even joy, like you see men experience joy as like some kind, like a baseball game, or it comes out like.
There are people who are afraid of joy. There's actually a term for that. It's called cherophobia. Chero means joy. I didn't make this up. Phobia, of course, being fear of. And there are people who are so afraid of joy because their experience of joy is that the other shoe is going to drop. Like, don't get too complacent. Don't get too happy about this because, the piano's going to fall from the sky if you do. So they kind of like downplay their joy because they're so worried about like, it's like this magical thinking that something's going to go terribly wrong. If I get this promotion, my child's going to get sick. Like whatever it is, like
that sounds
magical
OCD-ish,
thinking.
right? That kind
there is. It's an anxiety about. Yeah, there's an anxiety component to it. Absolutely.
Wow. Well, people like my socks.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, we're starting. See, it's an icebreaker.
A gift from my mother-in-law, who I am not upset with.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. This is why his therapy only lasted 2 sessions, because they didn't have like family problems.
That's really, most of them are about my socks. I'm going to ask.
I like your socks too, by the way, now that I see.
Yeah, well, it's a little late. I've already gotten a lot of love online.
Sorry.
I don't know all the terms online or texting. All right, I do have other questions while people go.
Oh, good. We've got
Well, text it. Will you not pay attention at all? Now I can see your face. All right, go for it.
As I said before, I love the book.
Thank you.
Some of the things that you kind of turned down that you mentioned in the book, like your book deal and kind of like the things that you regretted, I thought that was such an interesting part of it. And I'm not quite done, so you might address this in the book. But just thinking about how to work through those decisions and regret generally, like what's your point of view on that now, post-therapy?
Right. So what she's talking about is I wasn't supposed to write this book. I was actually, I had written a cover story for The Atlantic called How to Land Your Kid in Therapy, Why Our Obsession with Our Kids' Happiness Might Be Dooming Them to Unhappy Adulthoods. It went viral, and publishers wanted me to write that book. And by write that book, I mean for an obscene amount of money. And I say that only because I turned it down. I said no. And everyone thought I was insane. How do you turn this down? It was a very easy book to write because I'd already written the article. And I couldn't get myself to write it because I felt like I was just starting out as a therapist at that time. And what I was seeing was kind of, really meaningful things in the therapy room. And not that the piece wasn't meaningful, but that I really felt like helicopter parenting books had been written. And whatever I wrote, I wanted it to do a service. I wanted it to help people in a way that maybe they hadn't been helped before. And so I turned it down, and I needed to write a book because I was doing my internship. And so I wanted to write about what was going on with the adults. And so the publisher said, well, why don't you write a book about happiness? Which I really didn't want to write. Oh, by the way, they didn't offer me that kind of money to write the happiness book. So it was like the whole thing kind of was a mess because I wasn't, if I was going to write something I didn't want to write, I should have written the thing that I would have gotten paid a lot of money for. But I didn't. But I did accept this book deal because I thought it was more consistent with sort of my values and what I wanted to say about what I was seeing in the therapy room. But the more that I tried to write it, the more I felt like it just wasn't reflecting real life. It wasn't, I could cite studies, I could write an interesting book, but it wasn't really like, I wanted to bring people into the therapy room so they could see what, the human condition in a different way. But the problem was my agent said that I already screwed things up with the kid book. And then if I like got out of this contract, I would never write another book again. I would also have to return the money. And it was just, and I just felt like I should just write this book, suck it up, and then write what I want to write after that. But I just couldn't get myself to do it. It felt so fraudulent to me. And so I would sit down every day and try to write this book. And I was sort of like the closet gambler who gets dressed for work every day and kisses her partner goodbye and then goes to the casino instead of the office. So I would tell everybody, yeah, I'm writing the book. I'm writing the book. I was not writing the book. I was on Facebook. Sorry, guys. Sorry, Google. I was like writing fabulously witty emails to my boyfriend. And eventually I ended up canceling the book contract, not knowing that if I would ever write another book. In fact, I thought I wouldn't because that was what I was told. But then I thought, you know what? I just want to bring people into the therapy room, so that's what I'm going to do. And that became this book.
And now all is forgiven because it's done well, right?
I felt like I think with therapy, you can only work with one or two people at a time. And what I wanted to do here was give people the experience of what it's like. I think so many people have so many misconceptions about what therapy is and what it can do and how it can help. And I'm not proselytizing therapy. I think even for people who are not interested in therapy, I wanted to give them the experience of how can they see themselves differently? How can they learn something about themselves that they might not otherwise learn through any other experience? And that's what I was hoping to do in the book. And it's been really gratifying that for the people who have read it, that's been their experience in reading it.
All right, I do have does someone else have a question?
We have two.
And then I have text ones.
We'll start right here. Can we start right
here? Pretty juicy stuff.
Thanks for coming today.
Sure.
It's been great. So I know you've also had a stint in like entertainment. You did medical school. You've written. Now you're doing therapy, and you haven't abandoned all of those things to do therapy. You still write and do all that. What guided sort of that journey for you? And where have you felt like you've made major transitions versus sort of just like broadening out a skill set?
Yeah, that's a great question because I did things that at the time didn't seem to make sense. So I started off working in the entertainment world. I was doing film development, and then I moved over to NBC, and I was a baby executive there when two new shows were premiering. One of them, you may have heard of these shows. One was called Friends, and the other one was called ER. And we had a consultant on the show on ER who was an emergency room physician. And I would hang out in the emergency room a lot because supposedly for research, but basically because I loved it. It was fascinating to me. And what I loved about what we were doing on the show was telling these fictional stories, but they felt like they were really about the human condition. I thought they were really smart stories, rich stories, emotionally engaging stories. But when you go into an ER, you see real life. It was very different. So I'm seeing the real stories. And at one point, this physician who was a consultant on the show said to me, I think you like it better here than you do at your office. And I was like, yeah, well, it's a hobby. He's like, no, I don't think it's a hobby anymore. I think you should go to medical school. And I thought, well, no, I can't go to medical school. I was a French literature major. I have this job at NBC. That's just not going to happen. And I really liked what we were doing too. We would, choreograph the trauma based scenes. And by the way, little fun fact about George Clooney, who was, new to the world then. Everything is very accurate on ER, except for one thing that in terms of like wearing a mask, sometimes we didn't cover George Clooney's face when we should have because people wanted to see his face. But anyway, so I did go to medical school. I went up to Stanford, and when I got there, it was sort of the first .com boom, and then sort of the bust that was about to happen. And it was also this time of a lot of change in the healthcare world, which was managed care. And I was really interested in kind of being the family physician who would guide people through their lives. And I realized that that was going to be really hard with the new medical model. And I left to become a journalist, where I felt like I could really delve into people's stories. And I was happily a journalist for over a decade. And then I had a baby. And I loved being a journalist before I had a baby, because you could go out when you wanted to go out. You didn't have to, be alone in front of your computer all the time. But once you have a baby, I really needed adult humans to talk to. And so the UPS guy would come with all the deliveries that come when you're, diapers and, all the baby supplies. And I would literally try to detain him. I would be like, how about those diapers? And how's the weather? And do you have kids? And he would like back away to his big brown truck. And so I realized I really needed to do something about this. So I called up the dean at Stanford Medical School, because I used to run her mother-daughter book groups, and I loved her. And I said, maybe I should come back and do psychiatry. And she said, you're welcome to come back, but I don't think that's what you want to do, because, it's basically going to be medication management. And why do you want to go through all that training with a baby and a toddler and all that, when you could get a graduate degree in clinical psychology and do the kind of work, the deeper work that you want to do? And that was the best advice that anybody could have possibly given me. And so when you ask about my path, I feel like at the time people thought that these were really completely, I was either like very versatile or very confused, or both, like, why are you making all these jumps? But they were all related to story and the human condition. I went from fictional stories in film and television to real stories in medical school, to being able to tell people stories as a journalist, to be able to then helping people change their stories as a therapist. And so I think that they're all very related. And sometimes you can't see your path at the time, but if you follow your instincts and you reflect on it, I think you will end up exactly where you want to be. And I feel like all of the things that I do now, where I still write, I have my private practice, I write the advice column, I feel like they're all very much integrated and related in a way that I could never have imagined when I was going from thing to thing to thing.
So I'm very interested in reading the book, and maybe you should talk to someone. Well, when should you talk to someone? Because it's been all like, therapy has been stigmatized in popular media, and it's getting better. But for folks who don't have an experience with it, what are some of like those telltale signs that like maybe you should go talk to somebody?
What people don't realize is that you don't have to be falling apart to go to therapy. People come for all different reasons. And I think if you're thinking about maybe, just you're curious about it, go talk to someone. You may find that, it's not the right thing for you, but you may find that there was a reason that you were contemplating it, and that there is something to be gained by going.
I think asking a therapist when you should go to therapy is a clear sign that maybe now is the time. As a non-expert.
Yeah.
Is there someone else with the question, or should I go to my text questions?
Oh, you have some text questions?
I do.
Oh, great.
Good.
Okay.
Okay. I'm just going to read it straight
Go.
with all the emojis.
All right.
How to deal with PTSD at work and teaching others how to handle it without victimizing. And they're referring in the PTSD to work stuff like a zillion reorgs, bad perf, which I think is performance reviews, without being warned, sexual harassment, which is just thrown at the end, etc.
I like these light questions. So, I think it's a really good question. I'm glad whoever asked it, I'm glad that they did. Because I think that sometimes people are so afraid to talk about these things because of, repercussions, or they don't want to be seen as problematic. And I think it's really important that if you're experiencing something, to be able to talk to somebody about it, to understand it better, so that you can then say, okay, what can I be doing? Or is there something external that I also need to be doing? So is there something about me and my reaction to the situation that I can be doing differently? Or is there something going on here that needs to be called out? And how do I do that? And what's the best way to do that? But I think doing nothing is usually going to exacerbate the problem. And I think that, I know that you guys have therapists on staff here.
And there's someone here. Literally.
Right. There's someone here, I think, who is right. And I would really suggest either talking to an outside therapist to get a better handle on it, or to talk to somebody here. Because I think that you will get a better perspective on what can be done. It's really horrible to have to wake up every day and go into a situation or an environment where you feel like, something in the pit of your stomach and you don't feel comfortable. And it's really important to get help for that. So I would say definitely reach out to, those various resources.
You mentioned modalities or like disciplines within therapy. Related to your question about knowing when's a good time, how do you know the right discipline to be seeking out from a therapist, or what might work best for you?
Yeah. A lot of people wonder that before they go, and you think that you can figure that out by most therapists. If you say, I'm going to go to therapy, you'll probably end up with someone who you're talking to, right? Who's not doing like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. But when somebody comes to me, if I feel like say they have OCD and maybe CBT would be helpful with that, I will refer them to somebody to get them to the right place. If someone comes to me and I feel like they maybe need a medication consult, I will refer them to a psychiatrist that I work with, or any of the psychiatrists that I work with, so that they can get some information about whether medication might help them. So I think wherever you go, you will probably end up getting to the right place relatively quickly.
When Howard Stern was being interviewed, he continuously used the word psychotherapy instead of therapy.
Right.
What did he mean? Why was he saying that? Or is that
psychotherapy is we use those terms interchangeably.
Okay.
Psychotherapy is usually what people think of when they think of talk therapy.
Okay.
So as someone who's pretty good at getting people to open up to you about their problems, do you have any advice to give about how we can be more approachable to the friends or family members in our own lives so that they are more willing to talk about the things they're struggling with?
Yeah. I think what prevents people from opening up is a feeling of that they're going to be judged or criticized. Mostly people want to be heard. And so if you're really curious about them as opposed to wanting to impart information to them, right? It's kind of like a good example might be in therapy. One of the patients that I write about is this young woman in her 20s, and she keeps hooking up with the wrong guys and doesn't understand why. She thinks the problem is all the men. She ends up eventually hooking up with somebody in the waiting room, and she thinks that's a step up because at least he's in therapy. It's not a step up. And she also drinks too much, and she's not aware that she has an addiction problem. And if I were to say to her, I think you drink too much, or we're in the first session, here's why you keep ending up in these situations with men, she would reject that. She wouldn't feel safe really talking about some of the, what was really going on in her life. So I think if you want people to open up to you, you have to be curious about them. And it has to do with really listening to them without judgment. We judge ourselves so much anyway that the last thing people want is judgment on the outside. We are so unkind to ourselves. We are so critical of ourselves. I had one patient write down everything that she said to herself, like the voice in her head, for a few days. And she came back and she said, oh my God, I'm embarrassed to share this with you because I am such a bully and I didn't realize it. And if we said that to our friends, we wouldn't have any friends. So I think curiosity, compassion, when you hear something that you want to jump in and solve it or fix it or offer them advice, they're not looking for that. I think the way to get people to talk to you is to want to hear them. I say to people, one last thing I say to them in couples therapy is often somebody will say to their partner, he never listens to me or she never listens to me. And what I say to them is, how well do you listen to them? If you want to be heard, what kind of listener are you? If you're a good listener, somebody will want to hear you.
That's beautiful. Thank you. And thank you for doing this.
Well, thank you. Thank
fun.
you for moderating this. And thank you all for coming on your lunch hour here. I
and
really
thank you
appreciate
for
it.
all the contacts, the Google contacts I now have, so I can get a job here. Thank you all. Appreciate it.